We've made it. It's Friday, October 17th. Lots going on always. But there was an important case that I wanted to bring to your attention. It probably escaped your notice because candidly, how can we be on top of everything that is happening? But it really is such a heartbreaking case. And I wanted to share it with you because it just underscores and highlights the injustice that is the Trump administration when it comes to this absurd immigration enforcement process that is happening right now. It involves an Indian man. His name is Subramanyam. Subu is his nickname, so we'll call him Subu Vedam. And on October 3rd of 2025, Subu walked out of the Huntingdon State Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, a state prison. He had spent more than 40 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 64 years old is his age now. And this is a man who came to the United States from India when he was only 9 months old. You can imagine for more than 4 decades, Subu, with the help of loved ones, some family, and supporters, has been fighting to prove that he's innocent. And that despite having been found guilty by a jury, there was evidence that was suppressed by the prosecution. And after that evidence came to light, after the Innocence Project became involved, after a decent judge says, we can't do this anymore, Subu was released. And as he stood on the steps of that institution, that correctional facility, thinking, oh my God, I have fought so hard for this day, he was immediately taken into custody by what? By the federal government, by DHS, to be deported back to a country that he hasn't lived in or been to really in more than 4 decades, a country that really doesn't have any family in and doesn't have any connection to anymore. But according to the Trump administration, that's where he deserves to go. So let's get into the details of Subu's case. Again, maybe an outlier for what we usually are hearing about when it comes to these deportations, but just seemed so wildly, outrageously offensive that I wanted to share it with you. So as I said, Subu was released after more than 4 decades of being wrongfully imprisoned, and we're going to get into the details of his case. So in late 1980, a 19-year-old boy was reported missing, and 9 months later, in September of 1981, his body was found. His remains were found with a bullet wound in his skull. Subu arrived from India with his parents in 1962 at 9 months of age. He has been a permanent resident of the United States since he arrived from India, and he was raised with a deep respect for India and his heritage. Now, according to all people that grew up with him and knew him from his early ages as he was raised by his family here in the United States, he was known for being peaceful, calm, nice, friendly, no incidents of drama. He enrolled in Penn State University at the age of 20 to work as a lab technician. On the day that Tom Kinzer disappeared in December of 1980, Subu had called him to seek a ride to a nearby town. Tom agreed, went to pick up Subu. Later that day, Tom's van was found returned to its usual parking space at his apartment, but no one witnessed the return of this van. In March of 82, Subu was arrested and held on 19 charges unrelated to Tom Kinzer's death. Never notified that as an Indian citizen, he was allowed to contact the consulate for assistance. His parents were on a sabbatical in Germany, and when they came back to post his bond, Subu was charged that day with first-degree murder, and so there was no option of bail. All other charges were dropped. Imprisoned without bail for nearly a year, labeled a foreigner likely to flee despite having been in the United States since age 9 months, and his passport already having been confiscated as well as his green card, Subu sat in jail. Sound familiar? That happens to a lot, sadly, of Americans that are here in the United States. Prior to his first trial, there was extensive prejudicial pretrial publicity. He had 2 trials, let me be clear. Before and during both of those trials, the trial judge repeatedly denied motions for discovery, expert witnesses, and a change of venue, despite the pretrial prejudicial publicity concerning his case. The prosecution indicated it would seek the death penalty for Subu, and during the jury selection process, no students and others from the university community were considered, despite those being peers of Subu. The first trial held in February of 1983. During that, the prosecution had no eyewitnesses and no direct evidence, no gun, no exact date of death, no credible motive, no evidence of any animosity between Tom and Subu. A local teenager had testified that he had sold Subu an antique handgun, but that antique handgun could not have been the handgun used in the murder of Tom Kinzer. No other investigations or evidence was presented by the prosecution suggesting that other possible suspects had been investigated or pursued. The all-white jury of people older than 40 convicted Subu and sentenced him to life without parole. After a successful appeal of his conviction on the basis of things like insufficient evidence, lack of change of venue, jury selection deficiencies, etc., the Pennsylvania State Superior Court and State Supreme Court overturned his conviction, citing those trial irregularities, and so they remanded the case back for a second trial. In February of 1988, so now Subu has been in custody for at least 6 years, the case was sent back to the same exact trial court judge and the same exact prosecutor for a retrial. And despite the issue concerning adverse and prejudicial pretrial publicity, the change of venue was denied. The jury selected for Subu's second trial was again local, white, and middle-aged. Not a jury of his peers, right? Evidence presented about the body, the bullets, the casings, etc., right? That was presented. But the prosecution, right, was then now presenting facts about drug use among teenagers, but no motive, no credible motive was presented to the jury. Of note, the gun that prosecutors said was the murder weapon never produced, nor was any evidence connecting that gun to the crime charged. 40 years later, in 2022, documents surfaced that showed that prosecutors concealed, they hid an FBI ballistics report that showed that the gun that the prosecutor said was the murder weapon that they were trying to link to Subu, it could never have fired the shot that would have killed the victim, Tom Kinzer. 40 years later, only after Subu had the assistance of the Innocence Project and the support of supporters and friends and people who cared, who knew that he was innocent, was this evidence revealed that had been concealed by the prosecution. An FBI ballistics report that showed that the murder weapon that the prosecution said was linked to Subu, that it could never have fired the bullet that would have killed Tom Kinzer, the victim. For the first time during the trial, the defense put Subu on the stand to testify in that second trial. He was questioned for at least 3 hours, asked about really irrelevant questions about recreational drugs, questions about his citizenship, his trips to India. In other words, trying to demonize him for being an immigrant. Subu explained his trips were to visit family when he was young, ages 5 to 15 years, and that he meditated because it was a part of his upbringing as a Hindu. And in the end, despite objections by the defense, this entire exchange never appeared in the transcript, the official transcript of the trial. During the course of its initial investigation, the police department actually recorded interviews with various individuals, including others that were potentially suspects in this murder. Neither the transcript of the recordings nor the recordings themselves were ever provided to Subu's defense team at the time of the trials or during his subsequent appeals. These suppressed recordings and transcripts revealed ultimately a pattern of law enforcement investigators feeding information to witnesses instead of asking them to just answer the questions directly. In other words, it was a hammer in search of a nail from the very beginning, and the nail they immediately found was Subu Vedem. The jury in that second trial convicted Subu and sentenced him to life in prison without parole, But following that trial, some of the jurors said that they didn't think that they had heard the entire story. Now, I told you that eventually that evidence was revealed that had been concealed by the prosecution. And because his conviction was based mainly on circumstantial evidence, and once this information came out, fast forwarding more than 40 years later, right? In August of 2025, Judge Jonathan Grine of the Centre County Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania ruled that that concealed evidence that had been suppressed and hidden for more than 40 years represented a constitutional violation of due process for Subu. So a month later, the district attorney, Bernie Cantorna, dismissed the murder charge, saying that the retrial of Subu would be both impossible at this time and unjust. By then, by September of 2025, Subu Vedam had been the longest serving exoneree in Pennsylvania history and one of the longest in the history of the United States. So, thinking he is now free after having been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for more than 40 years, ICE steps up and says, hey, we have a legacy deportation order tied to a drug conviction for when he was 19 years old for intent to distribute LSD. At 19, Vedam was convicted because he pleaded guilty at age 19 to intent to distribute LSD back in the 80s, right? So despite that, and having been eligible for deportation because he was serving a life sentence, they never executed the deportation order, right? So now though, now that he has been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted, now ICE says, you know what? We want to actually execute on this decades-old deportation order, so we want to kick you out of the country. They have defined Subu as a career criminal with a rap sheet dating back to 1980, which is bullshit because the only thing he has is that one conviction from when he was 19. His entire family and all of his family relationships are in the United States and in Canada. He has no connection to India anymore. And I want you to understand and listen to what his family members have said. His niece, Zoe, says that Subu is a deeply compassionate man who transformed his decades of imprisonment into a mission of service. He worked as a teacher, helping many, many people get their degrees. He completed multiple degrees himself. In India, in many ways, is a completely different world to him. He left India when he was 9 months old. He hasn't been there for over 44 years. His entire family, his sister, nieces, and grandnieces, all U.S. citizens and live here in the U.S. Zoe says his wrongful conviction has robbed him of the chance to build a normal life and has left him unprepared for exile in a country he doesn't know. Subu, he's never been able to work outside the prison system. He's never seen a modern film. He's never been on the internet. He doesn't know technology. To send him to India at 64 on his own and away from his family and community would just be extending the harm of his wrongful incarceration. Subu's legal team has filed a motion to reopen his immigration case and a petition for stay of deportation while that motion is pending. They basically said, look, he's been a model inmate. He's led literacy programs, raised funds for big brothers and big sisters, and tutored hundreds of fellow prisoners when he was working towards a high school diploma. The first person in 150 years at that correctional facility in Pennsylvania, Subu got a master's degree, completing his coursework by way of correspondence with a 4.0 GPA. But what his immigration team says this: Subu could never be formally naturalized because his earlier conviction technically made him deportable, but his wrongful murder conviction, having him put in custody immediately, led it to being impossible for him to pursue any relief in the immigration system. So again, it's just the compounding upon the compounding of injustice for this man. As I said at the beginning of this video, his case is like several others, and yet I just feel like in some ways it's worse. To have to be wrongfully convicted for a crime you never committed, to have to serve more than 40 years in prison for a crime you never committed is horrific, right? The man has had his youth and his life pretty much stolen from him. And now to end insult to injury, Trump's administration wants to deport him to a country that he hasn't been in since he's been, 9 months old? That he's lived in since he's been 9 months old. These are the kinds of cases that I want to highlight because they may sound like they're outliers or just random things, but they're not. There are so many people that are being rounded up, scooped off our streets that may or may not have had prior contact with our judicial system. but more importantly, that have built lives here in the United States and with no pathway, with no amnesty, with no way to be able to achieve legal status here. Sometimes they live in shadows. Sometimes they just live in normal lives, but under the radar. We have to understand that our immigration system has been broken prior to this administration, if we are being frank. But this is not the solution, the way that Trump has gone about trying to fix our immigration system. He has decided that fixing the immigration system isn't a worthwhile effort. In his mind, we're just going to round up people that don't look white and don't look like him and his followers and his supporters, and we're just going to ship them off to third party countries or to, just horrible facilities in El Salvador. We're not going to actually do something to make this country better. We're actually going to make it worse by eliminating people that create an incredibly diverse fabric that makes this country worthwhile being in and makes it not white Christian nationalist. I wanted to bring Subbu Vedam's case to you. I wanted you to hear about it. You're welcome to explore it more in detail, but I'd like to know from you in the comments your thoughts. Do you think it's just what is happening to him, that he is being, there's an active pursuit to deport him after having been wrongfully convicted and having been imprisoned for more than 40 years? Is it wrong to want to deport somebody who committed a crime when they were 19, pled guilty, did their time, and since then didn't do anything wrong? I really want to know. And so let me know, and I'll see you on the other side. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together. So just this morning, the Department of Justice announcing that it has more than 500 people reviewing the Epstein files, but still no date as to when they're going to be released. Excuses after excuses as to why Pamela Jo's DOJ continues to break the law being the Epstein Files Transparency Act. But there is somebody who is hard at work, laboriously, meticulously combing through the documents that have not only been released by the DOJ pursuant to the Transparency Act, but also the documents that have been provided by the subpoenas from the in response by the Epstein estate and others by House oversight. And that's Ellie Leonard, somebody that I encountered on Substack. So impressed with how diligently and how smartly she's kind of going through the information, putting it together and making it digestible so that we can make sure that we're also not missing the latest on the Epstein file. So I invited her here to the Katie Phang News Channel to have a conversation. Take a listen. And joining me now is somebody with whom I have been dying to have a conversation for a while. She and I were just saying before we hit the record button that we feel like we kind of know each other already, which I love because I have been following your work avidly. Ellie Leonard, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. This is great.
So Ellie, first and foremost, I'm actually going to go and check out your book, Death of a Mayfly, which is your latest book, which I know is fiction. So we'll get into that. But you're a writer. You're actually a filmmaker. I went and I checked out your website, in addition to obviously being a subscriber and hanging out on your Substack, but you've done a lot of really cool stuff. But one of the things that I really want to explore with you, which we'll do in a minute, is the work you've been doing vis-a-vis the Epstein files and the tranches that have been released. But let some people know about who you are and what you got going on.
So, hi, I'm Ellie. I am a Substacker. I'm a writer. I came to Substack because I was just sadly floating away on what's called the submission phase. And it's where you write a book and then you're trying to convince people to read it. And it's just heartbreaking all the way through. There's no way to explain it. I write fiction, but I write stories for my kids. This is kind of where my love is. And somebody said, well, why don't you try out Substack? And I've launched into the world of nonfiction, unbeknownst to me. But I've had a small business for years where I've worked with journalists and I've worked with filmmakers and I transcribe interviews for a lot of documentaries. And I won't go into the list of the ones I've worked on, but you can look me up. And then this year,
I will interrupt. They are pretty impressive folks, so you should go check out the list. But go on.
Yeah. I've gotten to work with some really, really amazing people. And then this last year, I actually got to work like in the field as a filmmaker for the first time, which was very exciting. So that we have a little project we're working on this year that we hope will come out next year. So that's been really fun.
And Ellie, part of the reason why I wanted to explore your background quickly was the work you've been doing over on Substack, really combing through the Epstein files as they've been released, has been spectacular. And I think it really speaks to not only the fact that you are a writer, and so you understand kind of how to structure and set up the information that you're disseminating and delivering to us in the public, but you do have a discerning eye from an investigative standpoint to kind of like look for and find these things. Tell folks kind of why you thought it was important to really take a fine-tooth comb to every single page that has been released thus far by the government.
You know, before I started going through the Epstein files, I was working on Project 2025, and I was working on like the big, beautiful bill. And I'm always of the mindset that a lot of this stuff is made to be really muddled and really hard to read so that people don't read it, right? We're not a country made of PhDs. You know, we are working folk, we're blue collar. And so I just really want people to be informed. I struggled with the last election. You know, I just felt like so much of the issues that we've gone through in these elections have been based on people not having access to information or not understanding the information that's in front of them. And so when I was working on those two documents, I really went through and I simplified them and I said, look, this is easy to understand if we make it easy to understand. And so when the Epstein files came out, I thought, you know what, I can just keep doing that. I think a lot of the idea of them finally releasing them to us is this hope of America being blind and being a little bit stupid and just not looking into things, and maybe they can slide it under us and we won't recognize the things that are in there. And I'm not a big user of AI. I don't like doing like the summary AI and stuff like that. I know a lot of people like that and it works for them, but for me, I really just want to be like boots on the ground and just see the documents. And so I was spending, you know, I was going to work during the day and then coming home at night, putting my kids to bed and sitting for like 2 to 3 hours and just scrolling these documents. And there are a lot of them. And now thankfully I'm at a place where I don't have to go to work. I can just scroll and I can just look for things, but there are Easter eggs in these documents where I'll find something at like 12 o'clock at night and I'll just go, okay, I need to go search on the internet. I need to see if anybody else has seen this document. Nobody else has seen it. There's an email. There's, there's any source of court documents. And then I'll say, I think I found something, and I'll post it or I'll send it to somebody that I think has a bigger platform and a bigger voice. And I'll say, do you think this is something? Because I'm not a big breaking news person. I'm not a scoop writer. I'm just digging for information and I want to find out what it means and I want it to help somebody in the long run. And so there's a lot of that in there. I've found a lot of that. So I have a lot of little note-taking Excel spreadsheets and things on the side where I find things and then I dump them and then I go back and kind of do an analysis on what I've found and hopefully it helps somewhere.
So Ellie, you got the jump on what was going to be my follow-up question, but you kind of addressed it, which is the method to your madness, right? So it literally hasn't been anything particularly scientifically complex. It literally is, here's the first tranche that was dropped. Let's start on page 1, whatever. And however it's been bait stamped, which is very confusing too in and of itself too, by the way. But how it's start on page 1, check it out, read it. I know that I've gone through the tranches, not as carefully as you. And there's a lot of duplicative information, right? There's a lot of copies of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's also been publicly revealed earlier. But you know, it is interesting because it reminds me of when, I mean, I continue to be a trial lawyer, but when I've had particularly voluminous document heavy cases, they'll stick stuff, needle in a haystack style, in big document dumps. And I've been reluctant, Ellie, to use the phrase document dump when it comes to the Epstein files that have been released and rolled out so far, because I don't want to be insulting, right? I don't think it's a dump, but it is, to your point, strategic. The DOJ wants to park important information that they weren't able to scrub, redact, erase, eliminate. They sometimes want to drop it, maybe in a PDF that happens to be 400 pages long, and you're just, oh, okay, I've seen this, and you kind of scroll through it, and maybe you don't see it. So tell me kind of what triggers your interest then while you're going through it, because you don't have encyclopedic knowledge, although I feel like you're building that encyclopedia. Right.
I think I have some sort of there's a little bit of a photographic memory thing going on in my family that's probably helping me out along the way here. I don't come at this with a journalism degree. I don't come at this with any any kind of major degree that's helping me do this other than
don't apologize for
I know
not
I
having
hear
it
this
though.
a lot.
I want to be very clear. I do not have a journalistic degree, so
Okay,
keep on
all
going.
right. You have a law degree. I have a classics degree.
No, listen, in a lot of ways you're better equipped than me, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
Right.
Please go on. Please
No,
go on.
I think a lot of this is just like an analytical mindset. I go through it and I really, especially my favorite things to transcribe in these files have been the emails, and just because they are meant to be complicated. Nothing is chronological. And I feel like they did that very much on purpose. They dumped things all out of order. They made PDFs that are single pages. So if you have 4,000 pages in a drop, they'll make a single page PDF. So I go through and I combine them into a single PDF so I can scroll. But something that has been extremely helpful is, now that I've sort of built up my Substack base a little bit, I have put out the word daily that everybody is capable of doing this. And if you have 10 minutes after work, if you have an hour, if you've got your coffee in the morning, like, here's my Dropbox link to this file of 8 folders of 30,000 documents. Pick a folder and just go look for 10 minutes. And people have brought me the wildest information. And I tell them to start in the middle. I say, don't start at the beginning. Everyone's starting at the beginning. Start at the end. Start in the middle. Start
work your way back.
Start somewhere, because it's not an order. It doesn't matter where you start. And people are bringing me the wildest documents that I'm just like, holy cow, nobody has talked about this. And then I'll ask them, I say, do you want me to name you for finding this? And some say yes, and some say no. But it's so helpful to have more eyes, because you have 1,000 FBI agents, right, redacting, doing whatever they're doing. Then you have 340 million people outside the FBI who are scrolling. And there are so many unique skills that are people bringing this, like people who are paralegals, people who have computer degrees, people who can look up metadata. Like, there's so many unique skills. And the more people we've been able to gather together to look together, we have just found really, really, really amazing stuff.
So, what's incredible about what you just said is this. I obviously am kind of a breaking news kind of person, and I kind of go deeply analytical on a lot of this news on my YouTube channel where we are. And part of it is what I have seen, which is the kind of like hijacking of hundreds of lawyers at the Department of Justice. And the DOJ has made these representations to federal judges. Oh, this is so laborious and so time consuming, but judge, we believe in, the transparency. And so we're going to do it. And yet they still have been unable to get through what they currently have. And then suddenly, like out of the blue, we found another 2 million plus, or maybe 5 million. It depends on who you listen to, which is why I was thrilled to see Ro Khanna and Tom Massey saying, where's a special master? And, the deadline's actually today for the government to respond. And in my opinion, I think it's kind of neat because it kind of puts the government in a pickle, right? It's you either support the special master or you oppose it. And if you oppose it, it of course fits with the idea that you're trying to hide stuff. So Ellie, considering the fact though that how many times do you think now you've actually gone through what has since far been publicly released?
It's continuous. It's continuous every night. I haven't gotten through it all. Every night I sit down for hours and I scroll, because I have to set aside time to write. I have to set aside time where I talk to people, and then I set aside time to like scroll and take notes. And so it's continuous because I know that those next files are looming. And on that point, they've known about those millions of files for a long time, because guess what? There's emails in the files that talk about the millions of files from 2020. They've known.
Explain that to the people that may not be aware of that, because that's really important. Ellie.
Okay. So you have, as part of these files, you have both emails back and forth from the FBI agents during the case, prior and post arrest of Jeffrey Epstein. And then you have all the emails from the lawyers back and forth about the case, which is very interesting to watch it work out chronologically, like through different events that we now know and are very familiar with. We're seeing them happen in real time for these lawyers and legal teams. But one of those things is they start to search for evidence. They start to have raids. They start to gather evidence. And in that, they're saying, we're missing things. These files have been broken. These links don't work. We have over 1 million files. Where are they? They keep telling us they're coming. This is 2020. And I read something yesterday that said that they had one, I don't know how they describe it, like digital machine. I'm assuming they mean a computer, which Epstein had like 38 computers in a single house, had 800,000 emails on it, 800,000 emails. And it's like, where are those emails? Because we keep seeing things that are about other emails, or we see someone asking a question in an email, and then we don't have the next email that gives the answer to the question. So we need all of that so that we can put those in chronological order and start to see the threads and the conversations, and then we can make sense of all this. But we can also find the people in there that are not supposed to be in there, which has happened multiple times. Like the Larry Summers email thread is wild. The Michael Wolff email thread is wild. Like these are people that I didn't expect to see in the grand scheme of this story, and all of a sudden I'm seeing them off the record and with their guard down, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
So Ellie, what's interesting is that the Epstein Files Transparency Act, as we know, enacted November 19th. The deadline was December 19th. As we sit here on January 16th, almost a month later, the federal government, more specifically Department of Justice under Pamela Joe, continues to break the law. Let's just put that, out there, which we know. But I will always give credit where credit is due. I spoke to Congressman Robert Garcia just 2 days ago, and he really has been leading the charge on the Democratic side at House Oversight to get info. Have you been able to reconcile some of that? Because that was incredibly powerful and I thought helpful information that came from the Epstein estate and pursuant to some of the subpoenas, although of course we didn't get shit from a lot of people from the subpoenas. But have you been able to reconcile that document drop of information from House Oversight that still is on a rolling basis and some of the stuff that we've seen come out pursuant to the Epstein Files Transparency Act?
So I have the Democratic House social media, so I have them on my notifications. So whenever they say something, my phone gets pinged. Yes, they have done a really good job. And a part of that, and I'm glad you brought it up, is the Epstein estate, because that is a really significant piece of this story. That is not owned by the DOJ. That is not information that they have any control over. That is probably not very redacted information because it's private. Epstein it's like his last will and trust. It's everything he owned is the Epstein 1953 estate, which is the year he was born. And it bounced around as far as who was in charge of that estate. But right now it is Darren and Dyke and Richard Kahn, which are his accountant and his lawyer. They are in charge
who are about to get the subpoenas from House Oversight.
I sure hope so.
Yes. It's been passed. They just haven't drafted the subpoenas themselves.
Right.
So yeah.
They are some people who really, really need to talk, because this is where we just got all those emails from Steve Bannon and Larry Summers and Kathy Rummer. Like that's where we got all if you want to call it juicy, it feels like a terrible word, but that's where we got all the information that actually led to something. That's where we got the birthday book. That's where we've gotten a lot of these really big digital dumps of pictures and audio and video. Like we've gotten it from them, whereas we've gotten these little drips and drabs of kind of dry legal documents from the DOJ, which I'm sure is very purposeful. And so that's a very, very important piece of this puzzle, because we don't have to get through as much red tape to get to the Epstein estate. And there may very well be more in the Epstein estate than there is at the DOJ. So I think that's significant.
Yeah, I actually didn't note it on social, probably should have. Comer said the other day when he was bitching about the Clinton subpoenas that the estate had produced its stuff and was done. But Garcia, who I trust, not Comer, said to me on Wednesday, no, we're still getting stuff. I specifically asked because as a trial lawyer, I'm interested, right? I'm always interested in what is produced pursuant to a subpoena, which, by the way, is still also a legal vehicle, just as much as the Transparency Act is, although frankly, the act is a law that, again, continues to be violated. Ellie, I love the idea that this has almost been like a crowd-funded moment for you. So I have two questions for you. One, how can people be a part of this? Because, I was reading this piece the other day, and it was like, the lawyers are being tasked at DOJ to have to review a certain number of documents a day. And they were complaining. And listen, I understand too. They're like, we also have other crimes we need to be prosecuting here. But if people want to be a part of your army, this effort to be able to kind of help, how can they find out where you are, what you're doing?
Okay. So I'm on Substack under the Panicked Writer, or you can just look me up as Ellie Leonard. And it's everything I do is free. You don't have to pay for it. I love paid subscriptions, but you don't have to be. I just drop information because I think everybody should have access to it. But a lot of people have asked, and I try to keep reposting, but you can land in my DMs as well. have asked for access to these files so that they can scroll as much as they can on their own time when they have free time, because it is really interesting. And I think it feels really good to be helpful and be investigative. It's very purpose driven. And so what I did is, again, I took all the files and I combined them into a PDF so that they're easier to see all at once. And also that makes it so if they delete anything or redact anything after the fact, they can't do that to my files. My files have already been downloaded. So people have access to them, and I can give them the link and they can just start scrolling, and it's amazing. Like, I have a lot of lawyers in my Substackers. I have paralegals. I have somebody who came in and they said, I'm a psychoanalyst and I would like to look at these files and start to pick apart what people were thinking. And I said, that's amazing. Let's do that. And so as many people as we can get together, I guarantee you we have more than they have working at the DOJ for this.
But it's what a sad reflection, though, that's what it takes to have true transparency and honesty in this effort to give some justice to the victims and survivors of Epstein, Maxwell, and others. I always like to say the and others part, and I always like to include the Ghislaine Maxwell part, because I feel like people just kind of stick in that lane of Epstein only, and I'm like, no.
I have a lot more. That's probably Epstein. Another talk, because I have a lot.
That's a whole other conversation you and I can have. But you were very casual about it, but I don't want you to be casual, because you do need to be supported. And so if people also want to help you to make sure that you can continue to do this work, they can have the chance to be a paid subscriber for you, right, at Substack?
Yes. Right now I actually have, so I normally am just like $5 a month. So I try to, give at least $5 a month worth of content, which I hope I do. But right now I have it on 25% off. So it's $3.75 a month.
Amazing. Okay, so Ellie Leonard, this is the first of many times that you and I are going to hang out here. Yeah. I just really wanted to kind of blend my worlds. I too spend a lot of time on Substack. I love the community that I've built there. I wanted to bring you here to my YouTube world so that people can learn about you and also kind of support what you're doing, because I think it's very important. So Ellie Leonard, thanks for being here today, and thanks for getting me caught up. I appreciate it.
All right.
It was great to see you.
Talk to you later, Katie.
Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together. In 2009, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, made a finding called the endangerment finding. It held that at least 6 greenhouse gases, GHGs, pose a significant threat to our public health, welfare, and our environment. And since 2009, the EPA has had regulations that govern carbon dioxide emissions from things like cars and vehicles and facilities. But just last week, on February 12th, the Trump administration's EPA, headed up by MAGA loyalist Lee Zeldin, rescinded that endangerment finding. And now it's a free-for-all. And you know who's happy? The fossil fuel industry, the coal barons, and convicted felon Donald Trump. Why? Because he benefits. The grift is very real. But Dr. Michael Mann, climate scientist, University of Pennsylvania environmental science professor, and the director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and Media, I asked him to come here to explain why that endangerment finding was so critically important, and why, if the Trump administration continues without any types of checks, and if we don't get electeds in office that care about our environment and about us as people, we're just pretty much putting our pedal on the gas to an early demise. Take a listen. Joining me now is the person who is here to pretty much let us know how dire things are. And, Dr. Michael Mann, I hate to start off any conversation with such foreboding, but I do think that people need to understand how absolutely critical things are. I think that we kind of talk about climate change, we talk about denialism, we talk about how science, evidence, medicine, it's all kind of gone out the window with this particular Trump administration, as it did in the first kind of go around. But I don't really think people have an appreciation of how bad things are. So Dr. Mann, let's start with the first thing. There's something called an endangerment finding from 2009, and it pretty much allowed the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to make a determination as to greenhouse gases and if they pose a health risk, almost a public safety risk to people? And the EPA said, yeah, it did. And then it created this regulation on emissions. And just last week, Lee Zeldin, the administrator of the EPA, said, here's a new rule from the EPA. We don't have an endangerment finding anymore, so we're pretty much going to get rid of any regulation on emissions. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it is. Although there's one really important point. The critics have actually been sort of confusing matters by trying to portray this as an Obama era rule, when in fact it was a 2007 Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA, during the Bush era, that stated that in fact the EPA does need to regulate CO2 as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. The Bush administration didn't implement it. As soon as the Obama administration came in, their EPA did actually implement it, but it was actually a Bush era Supreme Court decision that laid the groundwork.
And I love that you did this correction of me and for the viewers to understand, because this is a very important kind of intersection, I think, of law, science, politics, government, because the Supreme Court, to your point, made the decision by applying a specific doctrine that the current Supreme Court has now basically gotten rid of, has jettisoned. It was called the Chevron deference doctrine.
Exactly.
And what it basically said was, pursuant to this Chevron deference doctrine, smarter people like you, Dr. Mann, and others should be in a better position to make decisions about things like pollution, climate, right? And so basically this 2007 Supreme Court decision said, we are going to allow the EPA, which is ostensibly staffed and headed by people that have our best interests in mind and that are more and better situated to make these decisions, So my question for you, Dr. Mann, is this: how important is it to have somebody not like Lee Zeldin heading up the EPA if the EPA makes these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, well, it's important to not have the fox guarding the hen house, which is what we have right now. And Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation, with fossil fuel companies and right-wing plutocrats at the table, basically wrote the blueprint for what they wanted a second Trump administration to do. So these rules, which were telegraphed in Project 2025, were designed to basically dissolve all of the environmental regulations of the past 50 years, not just climate regulations. As you say, the Chevron doctrine, the implications of the Chevron doctrine are much greater than that, because they, in fact, the Chevron doctrine recognizes that we should listen to the views and findings of scientists, of those who actually understand the environmental problems that we deal with, in formulating those rules. And by eradicating that, they laid the foundation not just for getting rid of the endangerment finding, but in fact, as they're doing, literally destroying 50 years of basic protections for our air and water, and of course, our climate.
So once the Supreme Court made that decision in 2007, in 2009, that is when the EPA said, you know what, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and we're looking at that and we're saying, these things are endangering the health of humans. And as a result, certain regulations were imposed to make sure that we controlled and regulated the amount of these emissions. So explain to the viewers, Dr. Mann, why this endangerment finding, as it's been called since 2009, has been so beneficial to us as not only consumers, but as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw in one more historical note here, because I do think it's relevant that under George H.W. Bush, his EPA administrator, who is actually, a friend of mine, William K. Riley, Bill Riley, a Republican EPA administrator under George H.W. Bush, recognized that climate change was a real problem and was already moving towards something like the endangerment finding. But then he was basically edged out by, he was pushed out by Bush's Chief of Staff John Sununu, who was closely tied to the fossil fuel industry. The same thing happened with George W. Bush. Christine Todd Whitman, his first EPA administrator, indicated that she intended to recognize CO2 as a pollutant and regulate it under the Clean Air Act. And then Dick Cheney and his buddies in the energy industry pushed her out. Christine Todd Whitman was out as EPA administrator, and they never looked back. From that point on, the Republican Party became a fully owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry, but it wasn't always that way.
So I love this. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and just to answer your question, the endangerment finding recognizes that CO2 is a pollutant. It does damage to our health. It's impacting human health. It's impacting our economy. It's impacting every facet of modern life, and it's doing real damage to our health. The extreme weather events, the floods, the heat wave, the wildfires, the water and air pollution from fossil fuel burning, extraction and burning. By some estimates, that alone, the water and air pollution that results from our dependence on fossil fuels, is responsible for as much as 25% of all premature deaths. So it's a major killer. The endangerment finding recognized that formally and allowed the federal government to make laws that recognize that damage, that allowed the Obama administration, for example, to oppose tougher fuel efficiency standards to decrease the carbon emissions from automobiles, and it laid the groundwork for the Clean Power Plan, which recognized the right of the federal government to regulate carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants, from fossil fuel producers. And so whether it's our energy and power sector or our transportation sector, those two are more than 50% of our carbon emissions in the US. The endangerment finding essentially provided lever arms for the federal government in regulating carbon emissions. With that gone, there is no way for the federal government now to do that.
So is there anybody, or are there any groups that you believe, Dr. Mann, have the legal standing to perhaps challenge what the EPA has done? I understand that it doesn't mean that states themselves on an individual basis could not actually promulgate or create laws that also protect us against carbon dioxide emissions, CO2 emissions, like the endangerment finding did. But do you suspect that there's going to be some legal challenges to what Lee Zeldin just did at the EPA?
Yeah, I think so. And you've already heard many of the leading environmental organizations in the country lay the groundwork for that. We can expect litigation over this at the federal level. And as you allude to, there's something sort of interesting here. There's some indications that some of the fossil fuel trade groups like the American Petroleum Institute were a little bit uneasy with this. And I'll tell you why they were uneasy with this, because with the lack of any federal standard, that suddenly provides states now to pursue litigation for the damage that fossil fuel producers are doing to them. So that potentially opens them up to an onslaught of state level litigation. And I think they might end up, beware of, those policies that you eliminate. In this case, they may find themselves increasingly vulnerable to those sorts of lawsuits.
It's almost like the dog finally caught the car for the fossil fuel industry, and yet states could create even more stringent standards within, for example, California, one of the largest automotive manufacturers in our country, has already indicated if something happened to this endangerment finding, that California was going to enact even more stringent standards to protect its environment and its people in California, which could then maybe result in that litigation you speak of. I find it to be fascinating because I really appreciated a few minutes ago, Dr. Mann, the history that you're giving to this, because what it does is underscore the importance of this conversation. As far back, if not predating George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency, this idea of carbon dioxide emissions being a danger to our health and to our environment and our climate has been front and center, whether it was deprioritized to be able to satisfy our, you know, our fossil fuel bromances that exist with some of these Republicans. It's been there, which means I would like to ask you to answer this, which means that we've already been in dire climate circumstances for decades. And now is this just like pouring kerosene on the conflagration then?
Well, it is. We need to be ramping down carbon emissions dramatically in the years ahead. If there's any hope of keeping warming of the planet below 2 degrees Fahrenheit, once we go beyond that, we will see even worse consequences. We will lock in far more devastating consequences for our health, for national security, for, our economy. Certainly, the cost of climate inaction is far greater than any cost of taking action. And so, yes, the elimination of the endangerment finding and its the limit that places on the U.S. and its ability to regulate carbon emissions could have global ramifications because we are the world's largest legacy polluter. We've put more carbon into the atmosphere than any other country. And that's all the climate system cares about. It cares about the cumulative carbon emissions. So the United States has contributed more to this problem than any other country. With the United States backing out of its commitments on the world stage, that sends exactly the wrong message to other countries. It gives them an excuse to ease off in their own efforts. I'll just point out one thing. Fortunately, thus far, we have seen China, which today currently is the largest emitter. Again, we have put more carbon pollution into the atmosphere than any other country, but instantaneously, they have now exceeded our carbon emissions. And we are actually seeing them continue to take actions to expand renewable energy, to keep their commitments when it comes to decarbonization, to export clean, cheap energy, solar panels, cheap solar panels to the rest of the world. So China, I think, has actually seen that this leadership vacuum provides them an opportunity to be the adults at the table. And it gives them moral license.
Thank you. Because I have been talking about the value of soft power. When the United States defunds USAID and eliminates the value of USAID on the global stage, when the United States, and I'm going to cite this statistic, the White House announced the United States is going to withdraw from 66 international bodies, conventions, and treaties, including key climate treaties that they have deemed contrary to the interests of our country. A lot of these have to do with climate and environmental protection. And when we cede ground to countries like China, and China steps into the breach and into the void and says, oh no, we're here. I think it really makes us impotent on the world stage to either assert, to your point, any type of moral authority or even real competitive authority, because I think international companies are like, we're not signing on to this. We understand the value of renewable and clean energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Katie, this is the great economic revolution of this century. And the United States doesn't get to determine whether the clean energy revolution happens. It's happening. And other countries recognize that and they're jumping on board. All we get to decide is whether or not we get left behind at the station. And so what's so tragic about this is that not only is it potentially harming climate action globally, but it's not going to stop it. And we're the ones who are going to get left behind, and that's going to have implications in the future for economic competitiveness. And let me make one other point here, because going into this next election, affordability has become, the critical issue in the conversation, right? And what people need to understand is that clean energy, renewable energy, is cheaper on a levelized basis than fossil fuel energy. So Trump's efforts to literally, eradicate our clean energy infrastructure in the country right now, it's taking the cheapest sources of energy out of the mix, and it's driving up energy prices. And so those increases in energy prices that Americans are paying are in part a consequence of Trump and the GOP's assault on clean energy. It is an affordability issue.
Well, and Trump is the, quote, undisputed champion of coal because he got that award from the
King
Washington Coal Club. So he's King Coal, COAL, is what Donald Trump is. He issued an executive order. The Defense Department is going to be entering into agreements to buy electricity from coal-fired power plants. He's giving money to 5 coal plants in West Virginia, Ohio, North Carolina, and Kentucky to recommission and upgrade their facilities. He's fired tens of thousands of federal workers from USAID, as we spoke about, the EPA, the National Science Foundation, the Forest Service, the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. You wrote a book, you've written many books, but your latest, Science Under Siege, the 5 most powerful forces that threaten our world. I guess we should have just put Trump, right, as the 5. But all kidding aside, Dr. Mann, I have found that we need to be having a gut check about how everything is inextricably intertwined. When we look at the raging, out of control wildfires that are happening in our metropolitan cities, when we look at the flash flooding that is taking hundreds of lives, including little children in places like Texas, when we see hurricanes in places like North Carolina that are creating multi-billion dollars in damage, how is anybody standing there and not thinking that there is a scientifically proven causal link between climate change and these events? And yet we look at Trump funding more coal, funding more fossil fuels, removing research facilities, getting rid of all of this. I mean, for me, I was banging my head on the wall. I bet you it's worse for you. It seems so obvious.
Yeah, it's so frustrating, isn't it? Because the facts are so clear to any of us who are paying attention. But what we deal with, as you know, right now, is this massive web of disinformation. And we've got, conservative plutocrats who are buying out our media and social media platforms. And so that megaphone of misinformation and climate denial propaganda is getting ever louder. And it's increasingly difficult for the facts to get through. That is the fundamental threat here. We saw that with the California wildfires, 2 years ago. These unprecedented wildfires where there was clearly a climate linkage, and climate scientists like myself, we were going on television and speaking out and trying to inform that conversation, explaining the linkage between unprecedented heat and drought and these massive, deadly, damaging wildfires. But there was this onslaught of misinformation and disinformation, blaming it on, everything from like water storage properties to raking the leaves.
The water not flowing. Somebody, what did Trump say? You didn't open the faucet. They didn't open the faucet for the water, or some bullshit like that.
Yeah, well, there's a knob in our climate models where we can turn on that faucet and all the water comes down and that got turned off.
Dr. Mann? Hello. Yeah.
It's just absurd, right? And the raking of the leaves. Remember that one? And
I remember that one. They should have raked the forest floor of the leaves better. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And George Soros and his space lasers that were causing these wildfires.
Marjorie.
I believe that was our friend MTG. And so, there's all of this propaganda out there, and it makes it really hard for people to connect the dots, and the public's really confused about those linkages. And so part of the problem we face is, and something I think you can appreciate, the changing media landscape that we operate in today.
So let me ask you a question, because you have such an incredible way of explaining things that makes it unbelievably accessible. Your books, the way you do your public speaking, any of the social media you, Dr. Mann, you make it relatable and accessible. How are we supposed to navigate the science denialism, the medical denialism that we're living in right now? I mean, I don't have to tell you, RFK Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human, Services is just an abomination. The guy was snorting coke off of toilet bowls, right?
Among other things, yes.
Among other things, right? So how give us tools, if you don't mind, Dr. Mann, other than following you, reading your books, listening to you. How are we supposed to navigate this? Because I think this is one of the most not talked about issues that maybe only pipes up when we do have a wildfire, flash flooding, heat waves, things like that.
Yeah.
But I feel like this needs to be talked about all the time, not just when there's some type of, spike in something, in a weather pattern or something.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Katie, even now when those events happen, there is a smaller window for that climate conversation. I hear less from many of the major media outlets now than I used to, say, a couple of years ago when one of these events happens, because it's getting squeezed out by just the constant noise, the barrage of Trump-related news. There's so little window and opportunity for these conversations, and the only way that changes is if we change, the political economy of our media landscape. And the only way that changes is if we elect policymakers who recognize these problems, want to do something about these problems. They recognize the need for regulation of these social media platforms and big tech, and the way AI is now being used to further weaponize anti-science propaganda. And so in the end, the agency, I always like to talk about the urgency. We've talked about the urgency of taking action, but the agency that we have, especially at times like now where we feel just completely powerless in the face of these huge, this assault on science and reason at the highest levels of our federal government and in influential media outlets that promote the misinformation these days. We feel powerless, but the power we retain is the power of our voices, speaking out, demonstrating. We've seen how important that has been over the last month. When people really get out there and express their will, it makes a difference. It can still break through. And we need to elect politicians who care more about the people they're supposed to represent than the short-term profits of the fossil fuel companies that have overtaken them.
That is it. I don't need to remind people that the fish rots from the head down. And when you have Trump, somebody like Trump at the top.
Yes.
Oh, is it? I didn't even know that.
Chinese
I thought it was
proverb.
more like a mafia thing. Or no, maybe that was the horse head in the bed. But I feel like, we wouldn't have a Lee Zeldin heading up our EPA if we didn't have a Trump, and we wouldn't have all of this deregulation and, like I said, this bromance with the fossil fuel industry if we didn't have Trump in the Oval. Dr. Michael Mann.
Imagine if Al Gore, if the Supreme Court had not stopped the recount and Al Gore had become president. That is an entirely different stream of history that has huge implications for the action that we would have seen. We would have seen action on climate more than 2 decades ago.
Which is simultaneously terrifying because, again, if we were having some awareness of this endangerment to our environment and our public health as far back as number 41, as I call him, George Herbert Walker, I can't imagine how much worse things are. And now, again, I feel like we're just putting, kindling on
opportunity cost
fire right now. Well,
cost.
it's the economy of everything. It's the economy of climate denialism. It's the economy of racism. It's the economy of everything, right? It's all driven by that. But I appreciate our conversation about the affordability component because I feel like sometimes people listen, sadly, not so much about kind of whether there's going to be a world for our great grandchildren, right? But more, hey, it's going to cost you a little bit more.
Yeah, I hope some of our politicians are connecting the dots there. I'd love to see our friend Gavin Newsom connecting those dots because that is a real opportunity.
Well, I'd like to see a lot of our governors step up, like we said at the beginning of this conversation, to impose even more stringent state standards, because if everything's going back to the states like they want it to do, then the states will be able to self-regulate. Dr. Michael Mann, I'm always so grateful to be able to spend time with you. I know you're incredibly busy. I do want everybody who's tuning in to please read your book, because I feel like Science Under Siege is the book that helps us understand the exigency and the agency so much better. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And it's a privilege to spend time with you always.
Thank you, Katie. It's always such a pleasure.
Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.